Hey guys, welcome to my first Patreon video. To start out with, we are gonna do this guy right here, or this lady right here. Anyway, we really appreciate you guys that are supporters and helping with our channel. And I'm gonna make sure that I get lots of great content for you guys in the future. It will be coming as fast as I can get it put out there. Anyway, I appreciate you guys. Let's get on what you're here for. Started out with my sketch on tracing paper, and then I'm going to use transfer paper, or actually a piece of regular paper that I use graphite on the back of to transfer my image. I'm going to cover up the actual highlights of the eye with a piece of masking tape and cut that out. I want you to see here how very important that is, the color of that eye. Notice the shade that I mixed up is a blue. I'm going to come in here, and the blue that I mixed is cerulean blue mixed with a little bit of white, and then I'm going to come in here and put that. Notice I'll use a gradient in that. It'll be a little bit more blue towards the iris. Then I'm going to mix a little bit of gray, and I'm going to enhance that gradient on the eyes, darken in little sections, around the top. That'll give that rounded shape to them eyes. You really won't be able to see that, but it'll show up a great deal later. I'm going to mix up a very light tan color, which is actually burnt sienna mixed with white, and create that background color for the eyes. That lightest color that we mixed, you'll see where I mixed it off of that. Then I'm going to come in with some plain burnt sienna and actually start creating a little bit of textures in there. I'm using Gerald Mendez Texture Effects stencil, the mini, and I like that one. You don't have to use that one. Obviously, you guys know I have on YouTube a video on how to make your own texture stencils. Then I'm going to darken that burnt sienna mix with a little bit of blue violet and make a much darker brown, and come in here and create the other textures in there. It's just important that you follow along. Notice that I didn't have a shield that was rounded to fit the eye exactly, but if you can't use the edge of that, you can move that shield around, use them circle shields like that to get around and just cover what you need there, get them crisp edges. And then obviously I'm doing a little bit of erasing, and when I'm erasing, that's pulling back that dark layer and exposing the original tan layer that I created, so we're not erasing all the way back to white. If you give your first layer of paint a little bit of time to dry, and you go gentle with your eraser, you can do that. You may go back to white, and if you do, you might have to touch that up, but it's really, at this stage, it's not that difficult to do any touch up on it. Now I'm going to pull out that highlight, and what I'm going to do here is notice the blue that I'm putting in there, and that's something that's missed quite often in highlights. Usually they're not pure white. Notice I made a little bitty tiny shield to create the photographer for the reflection of the eye. Then I had to use an eraser or an X-Acto knife to pull out that little bitty highlight in there. I took a piece of tape, and I'm bouncing my paint off the tape to get those lines from that window, and then I'll clean them up a little bit with the eraser. I am sketching out, as you can see, I'm sketching out my eyelashes. I don't transfer every line quite often. Sometimes I do my own freehand sketching for my paintings. It gives me, one, it's good practice just to keep my sketching skills up to par, and two, I don't have to follow those exactly 100%. Keeping all this in real time so you can see the exact flow. As you can see, I really don't have good control of my paint right now. My paint's not flowing right. Realize my airbrush is dirty. I cleaned it out a little bit later, but I did deal with it right now since I knew there was going to be a lot of erasing, and there was going to be a lot of scratching and erasing going on. I didn't get real worried about whether the paint was exactly flowing perfectly right now. So I did have a little bit of a struggle with those eyelashes. Again, if you do not have the skills to freehand eyelashes and things like that, You can use split frisket techniques, things like that. I'm going to have another couple more videos in depth in that later. I have shown some videos. You can take a piece of paper, cut a line in it, and pull it apart and hold it. That'll allow you to get those eyelashes very crisp in here. But in my particular case, I basically freehanded them all in there. And I'm not going to do all of my eyelashes now. I will do more of my eyelashes later. I just wanted that basic in there beforehand. As you can see, I'm using a skin texture shield. This came from Tommy Ham, and this one's that small one. He actually is not going to make this one anymore because it is a little bit too weak. It's so detailed, which worked out really well for me. But he's already going to cancel production on those because it's just so a little bit too detailed. But it worked out great for me, and I'm planning on continue to use that. And then I'm going to use that to create a lot of those textures without having to do a lot of work and go through here. Now, is that perfectly accurate? No, it's not perfectly accurate. I don't get too worked up about this. Even though this photo is realistic, it's not an exact reproduction of the reference, and most people don't notice that. Judging by the response I've received on this, most people don't really pay attention or care that your lines aren't always in the same space. I don't care if my skin texture, the wrinkle is in the exact same place as another one. As long as you have the major proportions correct, you get your values right, then you're never going to really have an issue that people will pick up on. There's a place for 100% dedication to following each individual line, but that's just not the way I paint normally. It's just not something I aspire to. Can I do it? Yes, but it's not what I do. Going at this in this speed so that you guys can see exactly the strokes that I'm using. I'm creating those creases, wrinkles, and things like that. And I'm going to come back with my fiberglass eraser and pull a bunch of those highlights out. There's actually more highlights than what exists in my painting, and I'm going to actually do some stuff towards the end to fix and straighten some of those things out. As I come in here with the eyelashes, notice how I'm just going to follow the shape generally flow. I'm freehanding them in. Notice I didn't even mark lines. If you need to, go ahead and mark those lines, but really it's going to be very, very dark and almost devoid of being able to see the individual lines, but you still got to create some of that texture and flow. Your eye will pick up on it on a subconscious level, even if you don't necessarily at first notice that those are individual hairs in there. And they're not, I'm not counting each individual strand. These are like chunks of texture. We're not trying to get down to, micro level, blade level at this point. I would use the blade or the fiberglass eraser or a regular eraser to pull out those single strands of hair, which will, in the long term, you'll have a few of those, but you don't have to create every one of those. I do jump around a little bit in the video, editing little things out because so much of it is redundant. It would have been impossible for me to post. Well, I guess not impossible, but it would have been very impractical for me to post this. I had 6 hours of video involved in this, so that's what I actually spent in actual paint time, was 6 hours in painting this particular painting. A little bit more than that with my prep, my transfer and all that. I'd say I had about 9 hours in total in this painting. But don't expect, if you're not accustomed to doing this, don't expect to get that done in something like this done in 9 hours. Many people will spend upwards of 20 hours in something like this. For me, this was about 9 hours work, everything all included, and that's a long time for me. I usually don't spend that much time on a painting, but I did in this particular one. I'm going to speed this up to 2 times speed for a moment, and but just be aware that that's not crazy. It's just double speed. I just didn't want you guys completely bored out of your mind watching me scratch and erase all these little tiny highlights, but I still want you to see exactly what I've done. All right, now I have mixed up the color that I'm going to use around there, match that magenta-ish color. What that color is magenta with a little bit of yellow added to it to desaturate it, but I'm working with a transparent so I don't kill all of my textures underneath. So you have to be careful to go light and not go completely cover everything up. If you go with transparency and you continue and keep adding paint, then what's going to happen is it's going to keep getting darker the more paint you add. But I want you to see how slow I put that in. Well, since I'm working with those transparents, I want to be able to control exactly what I'm doing. Plus, I'm freehanding in here and not pulling out a shield. So that is one of the other reasons that I'm going slow. And we're going to bring that magenta up into that brow area on the left hand side. And then we're going to do a little bit of erasing out to create highlights and a difference. You'll notice that before the eyelashes start down there, the area between the eye and the eyelashes. Oh, that color that I'm painting in there right now, I've mixed up a brown mix, a very light brown mix, which is burnt sienna and blue violet. And you'll see that very tiny line. I would suggest, if you're not used to freehanding like that, to cut in that, notice that very tiny, tiny line between the eye white and the break of that, where the eyelid rolls out. And then you'll notice I use that to tint right below the lashes as well. I'll use that color to tint off on the left hand side. And then I'm going to come back here and start pulling out highlights with my pencil eraser. And once again, this is one of those things where I don't necessarily worry about it getting perfect. On the left hand side, I came in with transparent yellow. I brought some yellow in there knowing that I'm going to bring a lot of other coloring over the top of that. I'm not worried about that yellow being perfect. Color I'm using right now is red violet, and that is mixed with, again, a little bit of that yellow. So I added red violet to that yellow, and I'm going to come in here and start shading in and creating all those little textures. I'm going to use a texture stencil again, just to keep and have that organic look, so that nothing ends up being plasticky. You don't get that airbrush effect through that. And this painting has a great deal of textures in it, so I wouldn't use as much texture stencil in every painting that I did or every portrait that I did, but in this particular case, um, you know, I'm working a lot with transparents because I'm going to have so much color going on. Believe it or not, I'm still working with that brown mix that I made with the red violet. I'm going to use a little dot stencil. Some of you guys know how I make my dot stencils. This one is one that Tommy Ham sent me when I bought some other stencils from him. I have mixed up a nearly black mix, and that is by mixing. It's a really, really dark violet. It's actually red violet mixed with a little bit of black. And so, although it'll appear black on your screen, it has that warm tone to it. The violets to mix it back in to make it blend out with the other colors, and creating a lot of those little creases and wrinkles and lines. Then, of course, my dots textures throughout that, and going to work mostly transparently through this section of the cheek. But in a moment, I'm going to mix up the blue color for that cheek, and that is going to be in an opaque, and that's a teal. In order to mix that teal, I have mixed blue and white to make a baby blue and then add a tiny bit of yellow to that to get that teal mix that you're looking at, that turquoise teal mix. Um, yeah, you'll see here in a minute. Notice that there's sections of this painting that have yellow that shine through the turquoise. So what I'm doing is putting my transparent yellow down first. Then I'm going to come along, and here you'll see me come in with the turquoise, and I'll lay off those yellow spots a little bit, leaving them exposed. So remember, I'm working with opaques now with the teal, so that even though I'm opaque on top of that. Now, people ask me about the color shifts with the opaque paint. However, since my color is a teal, even though I'm going to get a little bit of blue shift using that opaque on the edges where it hits that dark, it's not going to affect me whatsoever because it's already a blue color, and the slight blue shift that you'll see will really just not show up anywhere that I might get a little bit of overspray. If you're careful with your overspray, it's not going to matter much. But notice that the background color that I'm working on is also has an orangish color to it. Remember, I told you that's a brown mixed from a burnt sienna, which is an orangish tint, which cancels out the blue. So when they hit together, it works out pretty good. I am going to do some more work on this cheek later in the painting, and you'll see what I do here. Now what I've done, you'll see me bringing in another color. This color that I'm bringing in now is cerulean blue, nearly, that cerulean blue is pretty much full strength out of the bottle, and I'm just going to lay it in with transparent and work, transparently and blend in the edges. And then notice I'm using my fiberglass eraser to create more lines and textures in there. Um, these aren't random. I'm not going to say that I'm following every single line, but they're definitely not random. You have to look at your picture and see what kind of textures you have going on there. Try to match those textures up roughly. I generally will look at my picture and then follow that as a basic guideline, and then my textures will be similar to the textures that are on the reference photo, but not exact. I don't worry about if each dot and each line is in the same place, but I do want it to have the same appearance. Now, because I'm using a fiberglass eraser, I'm probably going to go back all the way to white in places, and that's going to be a little bit too harsh. But so what we're going to do is we're going to take that same opaque mix and we're going to gently work over the top. So even though we're working opaques, if we're careful and we don't blare the color on at 100% intensity, those textures will show up through the top layer of paint lightly. And that's so that is how you're working with semi-opaque or an opaque paint. By layering it in there lightly like that, you don't cover it completely up. Semi-opaque and opaque, really not much difference. A true opaque paint, there's no such thing as 100% opaque in when you're airbrushing, because the layers would never get thick enough to reach 100% opacity. The difference between people don't understand that there's levels of opacity, and it's not, there's transparent, then semi-opaque, and then opaque. Opacity changes and varies throughout. It's a range. Look for a YouTube video on that very soon. Working with blue violet mix here to create some tone and texture in there. But notice that blue is going to go in there and shift that tone. So I'm using a blue violet to deepen that edge in. And I'm probably going to go a little bit too far here. Matter of fact, I'm positive I'm going to go a little bit too far here. Yeah, and we'll work on all that. All the corrections and stuff like that will come in later. But also it's important to note, notice how I'm erasing out currently and bringing that back. So I'm creating some of those textures that exist in that brow. And then we're going to bring the eyebrow over it. So when I say the brow, the eyebrow, there is the hair eyebrow, and then there's the brow created from the skull texture behind there. So it's important to note, I don't know that I have a correct term to note the differentiate the difference between those. So when I'm talking about working on the brow there, I was talking about the actual skin that overlays that bone right there and not the hair. Use my texture stencil that I got there, and you'll notice that that first color I'm putting in is violet. I'm going to mix a little bit of yellow with that violet, make a brown. You'll see me shade that in, and then there's going to be also a red violet, and then the red violet will probably mix with a little bit of yellow as well to create those colors in that forehead. It's going to be more of the that's that brown color is the violet and yellow mix that you'll see in there that I'm putting in there to create textures. I added quite a bit of yellow to that. We're going to go from a brown to a desaturated yellow pretty quickly. So what I'm doing is continuously adding yellow when I get down there, and then I'm going to use that same mix over the nose later. But currently, we're using, it started out with that violet mix, and I added yellow to it to create that brownish mix. So I started sprayed my yellow, and then I sprayed my violet, then I added yellow to that violet to make this brownish color, but I'm a little bit more on the yellow spectrum than I am on the violet spectrum at this point. Then I'm going to come in and I'm going to add red violet to that mix, and we're going to create those reddish shade tones on the left hand side. After I use the red violet, I'm actually going to add a little bit of scarlet to my red violet to make it even more red than it is, but still pushing towards that violet tone. So you'll see that to create those various shade of textures. So I've got about 5 different shades of color mixed up by the time it's said and done on just this forehead. What I've done, what you see me do here right now, and I use this multiple times throughout this picture, is I actually took some Windex on a paper towel, and then I'm going to go through here and pull back textures with a paper towel to create some of those textures and highlights that I bring back. And it saves me a ton of time where people think I just erased all that out, and it was very quick and easy for me to do that. Can't always do that, but I do that with skin tones. I do that on sea life quite often, and any rust textures and things like that. Being that I'm using the Createx illustration range, I can pull back those textures with Windex. I've also used alcohol to do the same thing with many other acrylic paints. And I have even used reducer and done that with urethane paints if the urethanes haven't set up for very long. course, using my texture stencil, and then I'm going to use my eraser and create a great deal of texture and highlights and effects. And by adding the multiple layers together, it creates a huge, massive range of different colors, textures, by combining those texture effects together. Notice I'm going to use multiple different types of erasers. Like right now, this is a regular rubber round eraser, and when I erase with that, it is an entirely different effect than if I erase with a hard eraser, or like when I use my fiberglass eraser, that creates very sharp and cuts through the paint very quickly. Whereas if I use that rubber eraser, I can just slightly cut back the shades. Even with the fiberglass eraser, like up here, I'm only cutting back to the yellow underneath, but it's a pretty harsh cutback. Whereas the soft erasing, you can actually erase tones back if you're very careful with it. The color I mixed up here is, once again, desaturated violets. So you'll see that color. That is red violet currently mixed with yellow, which creates an orangish tone, sort of, almost to an orangish brown. Continue to add more yellow to my mix, and I'm going to come in here and you'll see I've got my line drawn where the center line of my nose is, and I'm going to put that yellow in. Then I'm going to bring that yellow back and I'm going to let it lay in over those other colors. But notice when I'm painting with that, I'm not just like spraying. I'm working around it like roughly a figure eight shape and pattern, and that creates randomness. And I'm altering and varying the height of my airbrush so that I'm creating a modeled effect. Then, of course, I'm coming back in with my soft erasing and hard erasing through the nose. As you'll see, you'll also see me use that Windex again here in just a few moments, and create various shades of texture. I was very fortunate because I had that violet working next to that yellow. I didn't have to actually create the skin tone that exists where I race back out. That near pure white that I'm racing out to is not pure white. It may appear white to you, but it's actually a skin tone color when I get done. And that is a stroke of fortune in that the violet mixes with the yellow create a very brownish tone, and with me spraying them and bringing them back, it just creates a very, very light skin tone texture. And that created me from actually having to mix that skin tone texture. That's just simply knowing my color relationships and knowing those colors are going to mix to create a skin tone. We're working with a We use the red violet again, and we just lightly desaturated that red violet. And once again, I'm still working transparently, so it's just be careful not to go entirely too dark. So there's a combination of regular violet, blue violet, and red violet, and then various combinations of the yellow on this nose texture to create all that various shade of color that you see on that nose. You'll see me often when I shade in that really dark color. That really dark color is simply violet mixed with a little bit of black, and that's that black color that you see, or what appears to be black on the screen is, is that dark color. It's a very dark violet. Yes, I used a black to get there, so it's a very desaturated but yet warm violet. So you've got, that black appearance, very dark value, and yet you still have those tones so that it doesn't create that cold look and mess things up. It's important to note that pure black usually looks very bad um, next to skin textures. You can get away with spraying black over skin textures when you've got warm colors like that if you're working transparently, because the warm tones will show up through it. But you don't want to take an opaque black. Almost never would you want to take an opaque black and spray it next to a skin tone. See me using that Windex again and creating those really cool textures. It's a totally different look than the look I can create erasing or scratching. It's very organic, and if I go too far, I don't worry about it too much because I can always layer over the top of it, and that'll knock them back some. You can see where I've scratched and how much harsher the scratching is than the effect I get from using Windex. So using the Windex and pulling those colors out helps create a mottled effect that, and the various shades and tones all start working together. Now I've mixed up a turquoise. Again, it's a little bit different than the turquoise that's on the chin. So the amount of yellow is varied by how much yellow needs to be in that color. So that is a cerulean blue with white again, but it has less yellow in it than the yellow on the cheek, but it still does have a tiny little bit of yellow. I want to create a bunch of these textures in the lips. Um, I will go ahead and tell you guys, I would use this as my violet mix, and with mixed with the black that I used. Use my texture stencil and one of my homemade texture stencils to create those. To create those hairlines that go up, hairline cracks go up, what I'm doing is, notice how I drag that shield, and I drag, so I'm spraying into the cracks, and I'm pulling the shield and pulling my airbrush down together to create those lines. And then the color I'm using right now is an opaque, and I'm going to go opaque over that. Later, you might notice, keen viewers may notice, I actually made a mistake here with the color, and I had to go back and recreate the entirety of that section from the nose down. That was a massive repair. I did not video the repair on it in this particular case. So notice though, even though I'm using opaque, how those little dots and textures start showing up through there in the end result, and they'll still be there. Again, I'm using my shield. Notice how I use that shield and kind of worked it in a circle, and that creates a more mottled and random effect. the edge of my texture stencil that creates little lines, and then notice I'm going to come in here. I'm using the X-Acto knife, and being that I'm working on aluminum composite panel, it does not like getting scratched on a whole lot, but if I'm careful, notice the way I'm holding my blade. That is a very, very light touch where I'm just barely scratching at the surface of the paint, being very careful. Um, if you're working on aluminum, or if you're working on certain surfaces, you're going to have a hard time with that. Being that I'm working on an aluminum composite panel, the paint is pretty easy to scratch off before it sets up, but not quite as easy as you poke. But then again, if you scratch into the aluminum composite panel with a X-Acto, you can actually scratch through that powder coating, which create a lot of problems. And then I pulled in a lot of textures in here. Notice I scratched out a whole lot, and then you'll see all that yellow that I'm putting in here. So I scratched out a lot of texture, and then I'm going to spray yellow through, and I will let the yellow run off into the turquoise that I made to create some more greens and turquoise, this different tones there. So it's not exactly what's on the photo, but it's close enough that very few people would understand or that people would notice. Now I want to create some really, really fine hairs or fine lines you'll see here. And what I've done is I've mixed cobalt blue, which is darker than my cerulean blue, and I actually mixed up a little bit of violet with it, and that made it a little bit darker than even the cobalt blue itself is, and start working on all those little tiny details. A lot of that is micro airbrushing. Notice how slow I work on that. This at that point, it might look like my airbrush is really close to the surface, but I'm actually a couple of inches off the surface when I'm painting like that. And I'm being very careful, low pressure, to only allow very, very small amounts of paint to come out. So I'm not trying to get, you'll see me move in to get those really sharp, fine lines, but more often than not, I'm just standing back very lightly tinting the colors. It's important. That gives you that subtlety. But like I said, I'm working a couple of inches off my surface. I'm not directly right up on it. The only time I get up tight on my surface is when I'm trying to do those really fine micro lines or those really fine dots. I've mixed up a little black with that same cerulean blue or same cobalt blue, and then I'm using a dot shield, as you can see, and creating little dots, and then erasing out highlights, because in reality, everywhere that you have a pore in the skin that is sunk in, you would actually catch some highlight from the lighting. Although we don't have to hit every one of those, you want to hit some. And then I'm using texture shield. Notice I'm not using just like spraying randomly through that texture shield. I'm actually spraying at little individual dots in that texture shield, so I'm getting those really tiny, tiny details. Working transparently on these lips, as you see me go in those lips, what's important to note is the direction of the cracking in your lips. And of course, I'm working on cracks that are outside of my lips as well. That color is we are in that cobalt blue um, again, and currently it is almost a pure cobalt blue. And then I'm going to glaze color over that, and then I'm going to pay attention to highlight. Notice that, you see what I'm doing right now? Those micro lines. Now, like I said, if you can't make those lines like that, there's other ways to do it. You could take a piece of paper. There's the bounce method where you take a piece of paper and bounce it off that. Some of you have seen that in my YouTube videos where I will take a piece of paper, lay it up against there, bounce paint off, and create micro cracks like that. But in my case, I could freehand them, and it was just easier for me to freehand them than it was to do anything else. Now this color has it's a little bit darker mix, and I'm going to create those. You see it's almost black, and I'm going to create a bunch of random textures in the back. And then I'm going to come back in with my cobalt blue, lay over there, and begin to scratch and erase all those highlights out. I'm going to go let this run real time for a little bit, but not all the way through this whole lip. And I'm just going to let that run so you can see that in real time. You can speed or slow as however you want. All right, now we're finally going to get into starting to work on these hands, and you'll see that color is a violet that I started with, and we're going to go through here using all sorts of various different textures to create the textures in the fingers and be able to watch this in mostly real time. You're going to use my texture shield in these cracks. It's important when you're using this texture shield to notice that when I'm working light on dark or dark on light, that the texture shields will create different effects depending on the way you use those shields. So you're going to want to play with those a little bit and see what the effect is going to be. Like later you're going to see me when I use it on the red, where you'll see I lay out colors and I'll base them out, and they won't have hardly any texture in it at all. And that is the light color from the background, similar like I did with the eyes. and then laying the color at full intensity on top of it, and that using a texture shield will create those little cracks that are lighter than the color that we eventually want to have. This really, really dark color that you see here is, um, like before, it is actually a violet mixed with black, and so it does have some of that warm tone. Even though currently laying it directly on that white and not directly up next to something, it does look black. Laid in that crazy, ugly yellow, um, which is just a desaturated yellow. Actually, um, it's sprayed. It's yellow sprayed on a dirty cup, which is the dirty cup was black. So I basically sprayed almost all of the black out of it, and then mixed, put yellow in that. It allowed it to be a little bit dirty, and created that kind of almost greenish texture of yellow. And I'm going to pull out all these highlights in here, and then you'll notice I'm going to use a really dirty orange, um, for that background color there. And then we're going to come in here. There's going to be a lot of just tiny little tedious work, adding little colors next to it. And how far I go there, it just depends. And that dark patch you see on the finger is again that violet mix. Those dark, super darks is that almost always in this particular case is that violet mixed with black. So I'm gonna, obviously see I'm doing a lot of freehand work in here. I'm gonna use a lot of shields and a lot of freehand work and combine that off. And so the colors that you have on the left hand side are that orange color is orange mixed with blue to desaturate it, so it's pretty ugly. And then the red you see is, um, I used red scarlet and scarlet combined, or red violet and scarlet combined to create a just brought that red into the violet texture. And since the red violet is a darker color, it just makes more value. Then you'll see here how I lay that in, that light tone in, and then I'll use my texture stencil over the top to create the low spots or to create the high spots, and those cracks will appear lighter underneath. But of course, I'm doing multiple different techniques and layers to create it overall. is much cleaner than the yellow on the left side. It's actually yellow. It's opaque. It's actually yellow mixed with white. And then the little brown tones you see in it are me adding just a little bit of violet to that mix to create those brown tones. And I randomly put a lot of those in there. Again, I'm using that same dark mix that we've been using throughout. Um, I don't save my colors like that. I actually just remix them each time as I need them, usually. But some people prefer to have that. And then notice how I just sprayed a lot of block in colors. So those colors, look how I just blotchy all that in, knowing that I'm going to be working with all my erasing and different textures and layers. That that I'm using right now is a dryer sheet. I keep mine in a little embroidery hoop, really cool way to keep track of them because it's hard for me to keep track of a loose dryer sheet because it's blown off my desk, falls behind my desk, whatever. And I found if I put it on an embroidery hoop, I can always find it. When I had it on my large easel, I usually keep them hanging up above there, and then I just change them out every so often. Heck, I've been using that same one for a long time. Just it's important to note if you use dryer sheets, use them after they've been used in the dryer, and then you can spread them apart and pull them apart and create just really awesome organic textures that are hard to achieve with almost any other way. And again, same thing as your shield. If you spray through it, notice when I'm spraying through that, I'm spraying dark over light to create those light cracks in between the fingers, which are existing in the picture. I'm going to mix up, you'll see here in a few minutes, the green I mix up is just, I believe I used the Viridian green and then mixed it a little bit of red in to desaturate it when I get into that. But right now, of course, working on these knuckles, still using that really dark mix. The mix that I'm using again. So I'm using an opaque blue here, and we're going to let that run into the other. Later, you'll see me actually use my texture stencils to lighten up on top of that. So I will both lighten with a opaque and then darken, and but my base layer is an opaque. So even though I'm using an opaque, by laying off those cracks, I'm not going to completely cover them in. Yes, I'm going to shade them in. They're going to lighten up, but they're still going to appear in my final picture. So all those cracks that you think I'm about to cover up with an opaque paint, I won't cover them up completely. They'll actually serve a purpose. Cracks before, and now what I've done is I've mixed up a dark blue, so we're back to that cobalt, and it might be a little bit darker than cobalt. I might have darkened it up, but again, it's the same thing where the cracks appear lighter in this case than the pronounced skin. Using the organic edge of that shield or texture stencil just so that I could create a shield to come off to create that break between that red and that blue. Which is one of the reasons I put the blue or the red in first, is the blue is much darker and more intense than the red, and it will cover that edge of that blue or red much more readily than red would try to cover up blue. Red won't cover that blue almost at all. So even though you'll get some tonal shift there where it overlays the red with the blue, it's not near as pronounced than if you go the other direction. Same thing on top of the yellows and things like that. When I lay the blue over the top of the yellow, it will mostly, just on that little bit of edge, you won't notice the shift to green. Now I'm taking and mixed up a light blue and spraying through my texture stencil to create that other look, which is where the cracks are darker than the skin being pronounced. So I'm using my texture stencil with that. And then I'm going to come in and do the same thing with a light or with a white later. But working over the top of the blue, I don't have to be concerned about the blue shift. White will lay directly over the top of the blue, and the blue shift won't be noticeable at all. As a matter of fact, these highlights right there are going to be too light, and so I'll glaze over them with a little bit of color to knock them back shortly. And you'll see me use the white after I get done using it on the blue. You're going to see me do it up there on that very dark section of hand. Um, Notice you'll see here in a moment when I lay this texture stencil, notice that I'm following, using the texture stencil lengthways. So some of those textures run in an oblong pattern. So I'm using the oblong shapes and following kind of directionally with my hand web so that the shapes follow that natural flow and tendency to follow the wrinkles. You don't just randomly grab the texture stencil and start spraying textures anywhere, where you can get away with that in a lot of places, but at times you just need to be intentional of the direction in which you want to go. Like on the knuckle there, I will just use the texture as is. I just want some rough textures right there over the knuckle. But in other places where the wrinkles travel in a certain direction, you need to make sure that you lay your stencil, any stencil work you do, you need to make sure you lay it in there so it follows that directional pattern. And after I got those in there, now you see me come back in and I'm going to freehand a bunch of wrinkles in there. And that mix right there is the cobalt blue. May have added a tiny little bit of orange just to desaturate it a little bit. I do not remember exactly, but I would have added orange. I could add black to the blue, but I'm positive I didn't do it in this particular case. And as I talked about in that, if you start adding black to any of your colors, remember it's going to get dark really fast, but it's going to desaturate really fast. And I really wanted it to have more of that blue tone. So you'll see I come through here and freehand a great deal of wrinkles and textures in here. I can run through that stuff pretty fast. This is real time, so this is exactly how I do it. Obviously using my stencil a little bit, and you can see about how dark that paint mix is right now. And so I will alternate back and forth, doing a lot of freehand work and doing work with the shield. As always, I can't stress that enough. When you start doing wrinkles like that, you have to pay attention to the direction that they would lay out. If you were just to start laying in wrinkles and they were bending away from the fingertip and or bending away from your finger, then that would look awkward and your eye would pick up on that and how wrong that is. The natural flow of those wrinkles follow around, traveling around the knuckle and back towards um, the finger. So yes, it will vary, and you want to vary widths and you want to vary line width. Obviously, you want to make it smaller in places and wider in places, but it's always going to fall back. Um, Important to note, you'll catch me do it later, is you'll see me add highlights next to those cracks, and there's always going to be a highlight around the side of the crack, and once you pick up one direction on that crack, it's pretty much going to follow because your light source is always going to be following from the same general directions throughout the face. There's times you have secondary lighting and things like that to pay attention to, but it's usually going to follow in the same direction. Of course, I'm using my a piece of paper to do like I talked about before, where you can just bounce off that piece of paper. And the color that I have in there now is even darker than the blues you saw before. This time I did, in fact, add just a tiny bit of black to the blue, but it's a very, very small amount. It is not much at all, and it's just to create a little bit deeper dark than what I had. There are other ways to mix your colors. It's just, when people say you can't use black mixed with black, I just find that ridiculous not to use a tool that's in your box. Obviously, I didn't desaturate or destroy the colors in my pictures using black here, so just remember that. Yes, there are reasons not to use black in pictures, but you can use black in pictures or black to mix with, as long as you're careful about where you use it. Notice how I'm going to come in here and be using that really dark blue mix over there. And I'm going to use that to go them cracks in there. But notice when I lay it in lightly next to that green, how that's going to drip, or next to that yellow, it's going to create some greens in that color. And that was that is about planning your picture out. I knew I was going to have some green in that layout there, and it exists on my reference. So by laying in the yellow, knowing I'm working up white next to it, or know that I'm going to be working blue next to it, the blue is going to naturally drift over there, and I don't have to worry about shielding off. If I had already put the green in, then I would have to shield over the green. So knowing that the blue was going to turn the yellow green and be close enough for my personal taste, you know, I just let the yellow be there and then let the blue drift onto it. Then of course I'm adding another layer of lights on top of that again, and I'm going to go through here. So it is a process of back and forth, a little bit of back and forth there. Yes, I could erase all this stuff out. But in this case, at this point, I just decided that it was going to be a whole lot easier for me to just paint rather than erase. And that is just to show, that it's important to know that you don't always have to plan on just doing things one way. There are so many different techniques that you can use. There's a lot of people that insist that to do erasing and scratching, insist, that because of the color shifts, that's the only way to go. And that's not the case. Do not ever let anybody tell you that there's only one way, or this way is the best way, or this is the way you should do it, because you're limiting yourself by limiting the amount of tools that you have at your disposal. And you want to get proficient with every technique that you possibly can until you find exactly what technique suits you best. Obviously, I got my really, really dark mix, and that is black and blue mixed together, and that's pretty good bit of black. It just gives it that little bit of blue tone to it, and I'm coming in here and emphasizing those cracks and textures throughout there. Like I said, I just choose to go through here freehand because it's much easier for me to freehand than it is to use a texture shield. Like I said, it's all about the various different tools once again, and I like to freehand more than I like to do any other texture. But the texture stencils, I picked them up after I had been airbrushing for quite a while, so I learned to freehand really well at first, and then I learned to add shields and texture stencils. But really, not having that trick in my toolbox was a mistake. I should have learned how to use them more often early on. And it can not necessarily elevate your artwork, but save you enough time that you can get more accomplished, which means you will learn more. So I strongly suggest that you start out using things like shields and stencils and things like that as early on in your path in art, and it's an airbrush artist at least, as you can, because learning how to use them will help. Just make sure not to make them a crutch. Make sure that you don't make them the only way that you know how to do something. So make sure you get those skills so you can freehand, but at the same time learn to use those shields, because it is a different skill. Understanding what's going to happen when you spray through different pattern and textures is a different skill than knowing what you're going to do when you get freehand. I'm using that same really dark mix up here. I'm going to cover up some spots. There's some spots up there in the finger that I chose to shortcut, where I'd had some green in there earlier, and I decided instead of mixing it up and making it perfect color wise, I went ahead and covered over it and just blended it in, and it's just a time saver. Um, I have nothing to prove here with this picture, and any more than what I already have. So there are things that shortcuts that I took that some purists might say were not the way to go, or a photorealistic artist might disagree with me. However, you know, I can tell you that the overwhelmingly response from the general public on this has been, I don't know, within hours of posting this picture online, I had thousands and thousands of views and hundreds of comments. So, because I post this stuff, in places you guys don't even see it. Not only did I have a great deal of comments from artists, but from the general public as well. Back there, you'll see how I use that dark mix to blend that in, and that helps push that finger back. Kind of a cheater technique where I just shaded it in to allow that finger and create that round edge. So you may have missed that since I was talking, but if you roll back, look, you'll see how I blended that in and created that shading that caused that to blow in. The color I'm mixing up some colors right now, and these are back to those same orangey tones, which is it's red, violet, and yellow mix right there. And so it's a little bit of a brownish yellow, but it's got a little bit more of the red side to it. So if you stop and think about it, your red and your yellow are opposite colors, so you know how that desaturates. You've probably seen me do that enough. But when you use a red violet, and if you don't have red violet, obviously you can mix your own. But having that little bit of extra red, not having to mix that red, just is safer. That's why one of the reasons I like the illustration line is because some of those extra color violet colors saved me the step of actually having to mix the color. And when you don't have to mix a color, you can usually mix smaller amounts of paint. Like I only mixed about 3 drops of paint to paint that entire little section of that finger there, and that was and so I'm not blowing through a lot of paint by doing that. So now I have actually added a little bit more red to that same mix. So I've got a darker red than straight scarlet or carmine would be. So I used that mix that I had, and I just added enough red to it to bring that red tone more prominent out there. And you can see the color that I'm laying in there, how it's a little bit different, but it's still that very red tone, but it's also a little bit darker. And then I'm going to keep adding little tiny bits of paint. I'll shift quite often. I'll shift the color that's already in my cup when I'm working transparently instead of having to start with an all new mix. And then I'm going to go through here. I'm going to do a little bit of racing and scratching and pulling out. You'll see those sections that I pull out all the way almost back to white. Those are because I want a more pure yellow. Those yellows need to be more pure because everywhere that I've sprayed little bits of blue and little bits of black and those green tones over there, I needed all those greens to show the green paint. But there's places that I want yellow. Now I've mixed yellow, straight yellow, with a little bit of white just to give it more opacity. And then I've reduced it a little bit so that I can airbrush with it. You'll see I'm actually spraying yellow and covering. You see the coverage I get over the top of that very dark color. I'm able to cover that with a yellow because I mixed it with white. If you try to use your straight yellow, even opaque straight yellow, generally speaking, won't give you that coverage. When you add a little bit of white to your yellow, it increases the opacity and increases that intensity just a little bit, because you can tell, if you can see the paint is really thin. If you look really closely, you'll see that it's so thin I'm actually having little tiny spiders appear off of my paint, and that's not an accident. That is intentional. I'm blowing that just hard enough. I've got it thin enough that it creates that little tiny blowout that creates those micro cracks that would be very difficult for me to create on my own. Now when I got over here to the right side and I added that opacity over it, you'll see I allow that to be more crisp. So I filled in all those yellow spots that I need to be very crisp, and then with that yellow mix, I added just a tiny little bit of violet to it, and I'm going through here and touching up little spots and adding little bitty tiny bits of color. I'll pick up a shield in a couple of places and make very crisp lines to get that simulation. As you'll notice, like how I create a line directly next to that white or that yellow spot, that is what makes it look like it's a blob of yellow on top of it, because it has that kind of outline to it, so it makes the yellow look like it's raised. And then I might bring in a couple of little highlights in that yellow too. um, so anyway, I'm really close to the end of the picture. I got some white again, as you can see. Now I'm going through in places that I think need to be lightened up, especially over there at that turquoise on the cheek on that right hand side of your screen. I knew needed to be a little bit lighter. So I'm going to take my white and I'm going to go put highlights in underneath the eyes, and I'm going to put white to extend out that turquoise. And then I'm not going to worry about that white getting on that skin tone, because after that I'm going to take orange, straight orange, reduce it down heavily, and then I'm going to very carefully go ahead and glaze orange over those white spots to get rid of that minor blue shift that I have going on there. Part where I go in there with the white or the oranges I was talking about, and you'll see that you can, if you pay really close attention, you can see I'm putting paint on there. If you don't pay really close attention, you won't be able to tell that at all. So I'll use that orange to shift those little white spots back just a little bit, and yeah, you might be able to see it on that right hand side. But when I talk about glazing orange over there to kill a blue shift, it's literally that light. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. Hopefully, if you decide to do it, you guys come up with something about like that. But we appreciate y'all. Y'all have a great one. Bye.